Hello again. I grow awfully tired of the pointless circular arguments one constantly hears about free speech, none of which ever address the only point worth considering. This is that all speech results in consequences, good, bad, or neutral. If by free speech then we mean being able to say things without any response from others, then the idea is a nonsense. Let me explain. I will start with a trivial real life example. On my way to buy my newspaper early this morning, I encountered a man walking towards me. It was a fine day, and so I smiled and said good morning to him. He responded by smiling back and wishing me a good morning. You see, free speech and a consequence. I did not need to greet him, but I was free to do so. He in turn did not need to respond, but he chose to react in a certain way to my free speech. Let us now suppose that if instead of smiling and saying good morning, I had scowled at him and said, "Hello, you ugly old bastard, I hear your wife's a prostitute." Again, free speech, you see. I think it fair to assume that there would have been a consequence for my free speech there, and at the very least I'm inclined to doubt that it would have involved the man smiling at me and saying good morning. This is the case with all things which we say. There is almost invariably a consequence of some sort, good or ill. This was always the case. It still is, and it will also be how the world works in the future. So, of course, I'm free to call for the overthrow of the government by violence and to try and rally a mob to lynch the Prime Minister. But there will be a consequence for this. Perhaps some people will applaud me. Possibly I shall be arrested. If I tell lies about some wealthy businessman designed to damage his reputation, I may find that some people agree with me. But then again, the man I malign might sue me for defamation of character. It seems to me that when people speak these days of free speech, they're not really speaking of free speech at all. They are rather talking of speech which is free of consequences, which is a very different thing. In other words, those talking about free speech in this way are not really calling for the return of something which once existed and has now been destroyed by political correctness or so-called woke ideology. They are rather calling for a radical new state of affairs in which people can say anything they please and be free of the consequences of their speech. There never was such a situation, ever, anywhere in the world. This applies to our private lives just as it does to public debate. I have a friend who is married to a very plain woman. I have never mentioned this to him. If I were to tell him how remarkably ugly his wife is, I'm guessing that my freedom of speech would have a consequence. In that case, it would harm a very old friendship. We've all of us known people who pride themselves on speaking bluntly and not mincing their words, and such people are seldom popular. I could use this channel to call for violence and disorder, but then there would be a consequence, which would be that YouTube would probably close it down. In other words, I'm free to speak in such a way, but there will be a consequence. I'm free to stand in the street and call for the death of those whose politics I disagree with, but a policeman might then arrest me. I'm free to speak in that way, but there will be a consequence. As I say, this has always been the case in every society since the very dawn of spoken language. The consequences of my speaking freely might vary over the years, from somebody smiling warmly at me to a man beating me to death, or to a social media company deleting my account, or say from people turning away in disgust and leaving the room when I express my views, to being cancelled, as they say today. But the same iron rule has always applied, and it always will. Free speech brings with it certain consequences. We may deplore this situation, but it has ever been so, and it always will.